Hello everyone, and thank you very much for being with us today at this roundtable by GSMA, where we will be discussing a very important topic, the recommendation for 5G spectrum roadmap in the MENA region. Experts from GSMA and from Plum will present our latest report, and there will be enough time at the end for a Q&A session. On an organization point, during the presentation, all the mics will be muted, but later my colleague Rola will unmute your mic if you want to intervene or make a comment or ask questions to our experts. Second point, the session will be recorded. It will be for only internal use, so person will have access to download slide deck, and the record will be people on that call only. Can we move to next slide, please? So this is the GSMA Antitrust policy and the policy we need all to comply with during that call. So basically, we will not discuss any agreements or exchange information on pricing, business plans, any other confidential or commercially sensitive data. Anything else, of course, you are free. Next slide, please. My name is Mohamed Abbas, and I am Public Policy Director at GSMA for MENA region, and I will be moderating our session today. Next slide. So, for those who do not know us, GSMA, how is it present in the region? We are actually a small team of 5 persons, and as you can see, we are spread over the region. We have presence in Amman, in Beirut, Cairo, Alexandria, Dubai, and Tunis. This helps us better support our industry in the region while reducing traveling costs in normal condition and even more when going through such COVID crisis. As per GSMA's region, MENA is composed of 25 countries. The map you can see on the right, your right hand. It counts a total of 600 million population. An important fact here in the graph to highlight is more than the third of the population doesn't have yet a mobile connection, which means that we as a mobile industry still have a lot to do to connect and connected in our region. Second fact is that third of the total connections in MENA are on less than the third are on 4G networks, which means that more than 2/3 of the connection are on a legacy network, 2G or 3G. In most of the countries in the region, 4G penetration is less than 15%, and even in some countries, it's zero, no 4G at all. Those two facts are, of course, very important ones. We will discuss them later with our experts, what kind of impact they may or they may not have when we try to build 5G spectrum roadmap for a given country. Next slide, please. This graph is prepared by GSMA intelligence teams. It gives you the commercial 5G launches globally. What you can see colored in red are countries where at least one operator has launched 5G commercial services. As we speak now, we count 87 operators globally that had launched 5G commercial services. In black, countries where one or more operators have announced 5G commercial launches sometime soon. We count 84 operators that category. I am sure you may have some comments here. Maybe we missed some countries in MENA region. Maybe we missed information. So please, I invite you all to share with me your feedback on the overall presentation, of course, but on the specific slides so we can update our database if we missed something. Before I move to my next slide, I invite you all to try GSMA Intelligence website. You can see the URL on the top right. The database and the website, the content, anything under GSMA Intelligence is provided for free for you as operator members. So please try it. I'm sure you will find it very useful. If you face any challenges signing in, let me know and we will fix it. Next slide, and it will be my last slide before I hand over to my colleagues. In MENA, we have our 5G champions. Those are the GCC countries, operators in those GCC countries, which were amongst the first in the world to deploy 5G networks. But what is the situation elsewhere in the region? We have countries in MENA region that didn't even assign yet 4G spectrum. Are those countries and the rest of MENA countries ready to move to 5G? In what condition? In what time frame? At what price? Who are the spectrum users for a given country? Who are the spectrum users in each band? Who is using what, especially the spectrum on the preferred bands for 5G launch? GSMA and Plum Consulting have developed a new report, what we'll be presenting today, which looks at the prerequisites for a 5G spectrum to be made available and the current status across 13 non-GCC MENA countries. It then sets out a roadmap to help governments and regulators enable 5G in the most efficient way possible. It also provides recommendations based on international best practices. We know very well that in most of our countries in MENA region, we are not ready to move to 5G. We know that. So for many reasons, for spectrum challenges, but also for other reasons like market readiness, like appetite from customer, like smartphone penetration, like tax burden, many other top issues. We know that very well. So when the time is appropriate in your market to engage with policymakers in discussion around 5G, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but when the time is appropriate, please do let us know, and we'll be happy to support you in those discussions. The report is designed in a way you can use it or you can refer to it in your discussion with your policymakers in your market. One thing I want you to know that we'll be presenting the findings of this report at next ArabNet meeting in September. ArabNet is the network of the Arab regulator. We'll be presenting the finding of this report to them, and we'll be relaying messages around 5G readiness in the region. Basically, we'll be saying that 5G is, of course, it is good, but you need to plan it properly. You regulators, we ask you to have an open discussion with the industry in your countries, with the operators in your countries, hear from them, and also you need to do it in the right conditions. That kind of message and the report itself have been agreed on with the policy group MENA. Policy group is a group composed of the chief regulatory officers of our main group operating in MENA. So we discussed already, we agreed on the message and the recommendation in the report. This is it from my side. I hand over now to Tim and Val from Plum Consulting to present the study, and then my colleague Peng, who is our senior director for Spectrum at GSMA, will give the recommendation from GSMA. Plum Consulting are our consulting partner for this work and for others also. Team Val, please, the floor is yours, and let's move to the next slide.
Thank you, Mohammed. Hopefully, you'll be able to see me in a moment when they switch the cameras over. As Mohammed said, my name is Tim Miller. I'm one of the partners at Plum Consulting. We are a telecoms consultancy based in London and Paris. And we've been doing this project for the last few months, looking at firstly where we are in the non-GCC countries in MENA, but also trying to understand what the steps that are needed to continue and to move to 5G. As Mohammed said, there are other challenges other than just the kind of the spectrum availability and so on, things like demand readiness and the market. That is not something that is unique to this region. It's a worldwide thing. But as I talk you through the kind of the steps we've identified to getting to 5G rollout, then you'll see where it is that we need to think about this. If you can just go to the next slide. As Mohammed said, this study, while it was designed to look at MENA, we have excluded the GCC countries because there's a fundamental difference in the position between GCC and non-GCC on the roadmap to rolling out 5G. And in order to make sure we have a report that can be easily used and is very targeted, we've looked at this region, the countries that are listed here in this study. If you go to the next slide, the background to the study is of course where are we getting to with 5G, but to understand that we have to look at where we have been and where we are. This diagram helps us to sort of understand the changes that have happened as we move to 5G. And we've got 5G NR here. I mean, obviously, one of the issues that operators need to understand is the difference between standalone and non-standalone 5G. Where you have non-standalone 5G, then you have an intricate link with 4G, with LTE. So whereas when we moved from 2G to 3G and then on to LTE, there were definite generational shifts. There isn't so much of a generational shift moving from LTE to 5G. And certainly what we've seen around the world is that 5G is only being used in most cases to add to the capacity or to add to the capabilities of LTE. And this is kind of quite an important thing, which we'll talk about later when you come to look at the roadmap. So given that as background and thinking about the countries that we were looking at, what we were tasked with doing was coming up with a generic roadmap, a roadmap that says, what do we need to do in order to get to a 5G network being deployed? And if we go to the next slide, you'll see what we've come up with. Next slide. There we go. So the first thing that we said we need to do is to identify what spectrum is needed, and then that spectrum needs to be cleared. Once that has been done, we need to then work out how we're going to award this and what technology definitions are going to be included, whether we need to have technology neutrality, whether there needs to be any obligations on the way that the spectrum is used. Following that, once we know all of those things, we can then work out what the value of the spectrum is, and that can be then fed into the way that it is awarded. We need to think about how it is awarded. Does it go via an auction? Does it go via a beauty contest? How is it going to be split up? What should the lot sizes be? And then finally, you need to implement that award. Now, this roadmap obviously is driven from a regulator's point of view. This is what a regulator needs to do. What an operator needs to do is very different. An operator instead needs to start off with working out what its business plan is. And then from its business plan, it can identify what spectrum it's going to use. It can identify how that spectrum will be implemented and rolled out once it is awarded. But from a regulator's point of view, this is what they need to do. And it's the regulators that this report is really aimed at. What I'm going to do over the next few slides is to go through each of these issues, each of these steps in turn. And if you go to the next slide, we'll start off with talking about identification of spectrum. So for 5G, there are 3 key frequency bands. And generally, these are pretty global. There are a few regional differences, but generally this is quite a global thing. You've got low band, mid band, and high band spectrum. The low band down in 700, or in a few countries 600, this is stuff that is used for coverage. And it's very similar to how you will have planned out your 3G networks or your 4G networks. You have a band used for coverage, but then you have additional bands at higher frequencies used for capacity in urban areas or suburban areas. So here you can see that you've got your low bands, I hesitate to use the phrase low frequency because that actually has a very different meaning, but your lower frequency spectrum at 700, which is used for coverage. The thing about 5G is that in order to get the maximum benefit from it, you have to have a large amount of contiguous spectrum. And I know that Peng is going to talk about this briefly later, but you can't split up the 700, the limited amount of spectrum in 700, among a number of operators and still allow them to have a sufficient big spectrum holding that they can use to get a good 5G service. I think the GSMA has worked out that the minimum contiguous band you need to get a good 5G service is 80 megahertz. And given that there's only 100 megahertz generally available in 700s, then you can see the problem. As a result, most countries around the world, and we'll have a look at this in a minute, are concentrating on the C band, which is the 3500 megahertz spectrum, at which you tend to have 300, 400 megahertz of spectrum available, which can be split between operators. On top of that, you have the millimeter wave bands. At the moment, there's 26 gigahertz, there's 40 gigahertz being identified. That is something that is obviously going to be used in urban areas only. It is something that has a very short range, but can give you a massive bandwidth. But as you can see in the table at the bottom of this slide, what we've seen at the GCC countries is that the main focus is on the mid-band spectrum. It's generally on the C-band. There are a few countries where they've identified spectrum in 2300 and 2600 megahertz and have awarded that for 5G. Of course, 2600 has often been awarded for LTE spectrum and is already in use by operators. But generally, the C-band is kind of the area that people are concentrating on. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see it's not just the GCC countries. It is all over the world. You can see the dark purple shade here are places where the C-band has already been assigned for 5G, and the light purple ones where it is upcoming. Generally, this is seen as being the most important bands, especially by regulators, for 5G. So we obviously think that across the countries we've studied, there's going to be a kind of significant interest in awarding the C-band spectrum. But the 700 megahertz band and the millimeter wave band shouldn't be ignored either. So if you go to the next slide, once the regulators have decided which spectrum bands they want to award to enable operators to roll out 5G, the first thing they need to do is to make sure that spectrum is available. And unfortunately, we often find that spectrum has been used by other services in the past, or is currently being used for other services. Now, the actual use varies significantly depending on bands. We know that 2600 and also the C band is often used by fixed links, and the C band is also often used by satellite services and also by governmental services. And trying to move other users out of this band can actually be a significant time and cost to regulators. That's not to say it shouldn't be done. And when you think about the fact that neighbouring countries are going to be doing it, and there will be interference issues around borders due to that, it's very clear that there is going to be a significant benefit to this clearance happening. But one of the things that we have found, especially when we've worked in places like Egypt and when we've worked in some Caribbean countries, is that regulators need some help to clear spectrum and to identify how it should be cleared. So this is something that we are quite keen to kind of push as a kind of it's something that will stop this being blocked. The other thing to consider is that sometimes actually MNOs or other telecoms operators already have the licenses in these areas, but they're used for fixed wireless access or for fixed links or so on. And one easy way of allowing this spectrum to be used for 5G is to simply change the licenses so they are technology and service neutral, which will allow 5G to be rolled out much quicker and effectively shifts the spectrum clearance question over to the operators instead. If you can go to the next slide. The next two steps effectively mean that the regulators start to move to understanding how the spectrum needs to be awarded. First of all, there's the question about license restrictions or any technical conditions. Now, one of the reasons that it's beneficial to look at this sort of stuff on a regional level is because, as we all know, radio waves do not stop at geographic borders. And in order to make sure that you're not causing a huge amount of interference between countries, especially on the 700, but to some extent on the C-band as well, then we need to put certain restrictions on the way that spectrum can be used. The restrictions are much lower if each country is using it in the same way. And it's not just geographic restrictions. We also need to think about restrictions to make sure there's not interference between bands. Now, this is a kind of a detailed technical study that we've done a number of times before, and I'm sure that internally each of the operators on this call, each of the members on this call has done similar work. Regulators sometimes find this stuff a bit difficult, again, because sometimes they don't have the expertise internally. Sometimes they're not sure where to go to get it. So again, this is something where operators and the GSMA can help the regulators. Once all of this has been done, let's be clear. I don't know of a single instance where we've gone to a regulator and asked what the objectives for a spectrum award are, and they've said, we want to get money from this award. They always say it's about making sure there's efficient use of spectrum, that they get all the spectrum into the market as quickly as possible, and so on. But at the same time, you never want to get to the end of an award and people say, well, we wanted to get more money for that. So regulators want to make sure they understand the value of spectrum. They want to make sure they're not giving away an asset at too low a price. And also, they want to make sure that they are awarding it to operators who are actually going to use it, rather than people who want to basically sit on it and then try and sell it on to operators at a higher price. So what we generally tend to find is that even where it's going to be an auction and there's going to be an open tender process so that the market can decide on the value, then regulators do want to set some sort of reserve price or set annual fees, or the other way around. And we've recently released an insight paper focusing on this issue. Sometimes there's a significant issue where annual fees are too high compared to the value of the spectrum, and regulation needs to do something about that. I mean, we often find that where annual fees have been set historically based on the value of LTE spectrum in kind of the lower frequency, in say 800 or even 1800 bands, then the annual fee that is charged per megahertz is just far too high when it comes to thinking about getting 100 megahertz of spectrum in C bands. So there's quite a lot of stuff to think about there, both from the regulator's point of view, but also the operator's point of view. And certainly, we've supported some operators when we were working with regulators. We've supported some operators in their arguments that actually existing annual fees are far too high and they need to be brought down. So spectrum valuation is a very key point here. And the last thing that you want is for the regulator to identify what spectrum is going to be used, work out how it's going to be clear it, make sure it's all happy to be used, set all the technical limitations, and then they start to charge you far too much, which means your business case falls apart. So there's a very important point here. If you move on to the next slide. The final two steps are to work out how the spectrum is going to be awarded and given out to operators, and then to actually do that award. Now, there are different ways that spectrum can be awarded. Generally, a lot of places have been using auctions for the last few years, or the last couple of decades even. Increasingly, we're seeing that auctions are not necessarily the right way to do things. Auctions were very good when you're thinking about there being new entrants to the market, if you wanted to give the ability for a new entrant to come in. But at the moment, given the kind of the consolidation in a lot of markets and the falling ARPU, the falling profitability of mobile operators, and the economies of scale that are needed to make a 5G network a realistic possibility, then actually it may be that a beauty contest or even a direct award may work better. Any sort of design for the award needs to take account of how the spectrum is going to be used, how much is available, who needs it, and what the existing market looks like. And then once that has been designed, obviously there's normally a consultation with operators. There's a very important point for you at that point to think about what this means for the way that spectrum is going to be allocated. And then also you need to input on the timing as well, making sure that it's being awarded in the right way for you. One of the things we have found, for example, is that in a few European countries and in a few places in Asia, they were giving away spectrum, or not giving away, awarding spectrum in a bulk. There was a multi-band auction where they were awarding spectrum in lower frequencies and higher frequencies all at the same time. In Sweden, in fact, there were 7 different bands that they awarded in a single contest. That makes it very difficult for an operator to be able to plan what your strategy should look like, because sometimes your usage in one band is dependent on your holdings in another band. So what we did find actually in Saudi Arabia, where we recently helped them with an auction, with a number of auctions actually, was that they wanted to hold things sequentially, so operators had greater certainty over their holdings in one band before they started bidding on the next. So having defined this roadmap, what we then went to do is to think about where the non-GCC MENA countries are on that roadmap. And if you go to the next slide, you can see our conclusions. And the first thing you'll see is that we no longer have this 6-step roadmap on this slide. Instead, we've had to stick some stuff before that, because not everyone is actually at the point where they are thinking about 5G at all yet. Indeed, there are some countries which don't yet have a functioning LTE network in the region. And this is where I have identified each country to be. We're going to go through these in blocks over the next few slides. But the main thing to note is that the blue arrows on the left-hand side of this slide are what is needed to get to the point where you're identifying the demand for 5G. And to do that, you have to have 4G running. And to do that, you have to have worked out the spectrum that's needed for 4G. This slide is actually out of date as of a couple of days ago, because we are aware that Iraq has now identified spectrum for 4G, and there will be a 4G network established in Iraq by January 2021. So that will be moving up. If you go to the next slide. So the first thing we looked at were countries where they haven't awarded the 4G spectrum, or there aren't 4G networks currently in place. And a number of years ago, I remember President Erdogan of Turkey saying that he was not interested in 4G because he just wanted to jump straight to 5G, which obviously was never going to happen. But also, with the way that 5G has developed, it doesn't make any sense, because 5G is run very much at the moment as an increment on top of LTE, on top of 4G. And we know that 4G is going to continue to play a very key role in network development over the next couple of decades, alongside 5G. And that's not necessarily true of 2G and 3G. I mean, 2G and 3G are being phased out in a number of places around the world. Sometimes 3G before 2G, because 2G supports a number of Internet of Things devices and so on. But we know that 4G is going to have a very kind of key part to play. So although 5G exists in the market, we do not recommend that you jump straight to 5G and do not put in a 4G network. So our recommendations for these countries, Mauritania and Palestine particularly, are to make sure there is a 4G network in place. And for Palestine, I know that there are issues in terms of spectrum availability, but that's something that we need to obviously concentrate on over time. One of the interesting and important things, though, is that in order to make sure that operators can make effective decisions about how their 4G and 5G networks are working, any 4G spectrum that is awarded should be awarded on a technology neutral basis, so that it can be awarded, it can be used for 5G in the long term. But the main thing to note is that we have this roadmap we've developed for 5G that can be used for 4G as well. I mean, the steps are pretty much the same, but obviously it's different spectrum and different concerns, and we need to get this happening pretty quickly. Next slide. The point obviously there is to try and get those countries, and Iraq is on the way, to move to the next point where you have a 4G network being deployed and in use. And we can see that there are a few countries, Djibouti, Libya, and Sudan, where 4G networks are in place, but they need to grow and they need to be developed further. And as you will know, as members of GSMA and as operators, there is an issue around understanding the business case for 5G. It is very much, as I said a few times already, an increment on top of LTE in the way it can be used at the moment, and there are things that it will be able to do in the future, but really the business case for it does depend on there being capacity needs that can't be met with LTE, or other service needs that can't be met with LTE. And until the 4G LTE networks are developed and established in the country, then often the investments for 5G are just not going to be realistic. So what Djibouti, Libya and Sudan need to do at this point is to make sure they understand where the demand for 5G is and where there are going to be capacity needs and at what point. That's not to say that they shouldn't do any work on 5G starting kind of now. They absolutely should. They should be thinking about what spectrum bands should be available. It's just that it might be too early to ask operators to spend lots of money on a 15-year license if they're not going to use it for the first 5 years. Instead, you should be thinking about a kind of a longer-term roadmap. And then if you go to the next slide, this is where the majority of the countries we've looked at are. It's at the start of the 5G roadmap. Step 1, step 2, we are identifying which spectrum bands the operators need and starting to clear those and starting to work out what needs to be done. In all these countries, we can see that 2G and 3G connections are decreasing in number. 4G connections are increasing at a very fast rate. And there is going to be, at some point in the future, a capacity crunch on LTE. Now, when I say some point in the future, that could be by 2030. It could be slightly before that. But if you wait until then your mobile networks are going to be falling over and people are not going to be happy. So we need to make sure that 5G networks are in place well before then in order to make sure that we can provide customers with the service they need. So we know that there are 5G tests and trials happening around the region. There's one operator in the Netherlands we know that is planning a 5G network, but all of this needs the regulator to have a plan for spectrum award in order to be realistic. So let's talk about spectrum. If you go to the next slide, the spectrum availability is different in every single country, and I don't plan to go through all of this in detail because what you are interested in is important for your country. And if you look at our reports, then we have got a detailed look at most of these countries, and you can see what the current position is. But the important things to note are, for example, in Tunisia, the 700 megahertz band, which I mentioned as being kind of an important one for coverage, that's already available. That's been cleared in Tunisia, and so that should be awarded as soon as possible so that operators can start planning their coverage network. The 3500 bands, there has been some modification of that to allow LTE use, but actually that needs to be varied for 5G as well. in Jordan, there's currently fixed wireless access in 3500 band. There should be, and those licenses are expiring in 2022. In 2022, there's obviously a very key point there that can be varied. But the point is that you need to look in each country individually at the spectrum availability and what the current position is. So although we have this generic roadmap saying what needs to be done, you can't just take that and say to the regulator, here you go, this is what you need to do, because the spectrum needs in each country are different. If you flick to the next slide, we have some specific recommendations for Egypt and for Turkey and for Morocco as well. Morocco is interesting because actually there's current use of the 800 bands, which could be released for 5G. It's not as ideal as 700 because 700 obviously has the ecosystem around the world that is used for this, but 800 can be used as well. But our key takeaway from our overall report, by looking at the general roadmap and looking at the position across the entire region, is that every country now needs to make sure that the stages 1 and 2 of that roadmap are completed, or at least in the process of being completed, so that there can be a timely award of spectrum for when operators actually need it for 5G. That's the main conclusion of our report, but obviously there's a lot more detail in that. I'm going to hand over now to Peng, who's going to talk about kind of some of the general conclusions and what the GSMA is looking to do with the results of this. Peng, I think you're online now.
Right, thanks a lot, Tim, and thanks, Mohammed, for organizing this workshop. Can we move to the next slide, please? So, as Mohammed introduced, I'm the Spectrum Senior Director for GSMA. If we can move to the next slide. I just want to share some of the key takeaway and the kind of key messaging that we'll be pushing to the regulators to whom we're going to present that report. I think for that, we should just take one step back to say, okay, why did we do such kind of a report? I mean, of course, as Tim mentioned, there's a generic roadmap as part of the report, and we talk about how to get to the 5G. But that, again, is a kind of generic guideline. There's no one-size-fits-all on those kind of roadmap. So those are the 3 key areas that each regulator, when they have the document, they understand the importance of this roadmap. Those are the 3 areas they need to focus on to provide something more meaningful and useful for their own country and for the operator in the market. The first thing is to assess, to make complete market assessments and to understand, what are the bands that is being considered for 5G and what are those bands, where are those bands, so who are using those bands right now. So understand the incumbency and how easy and how much time it will take to release those bands and to make it available for mobile broadband. The second thing is also important is the timing. As Tim explained in the reports, there's quite a few difference of stage where each country are. We know that most of the governments at least like to talk about 5G and like to be in the race and the pushing or member operators to have 5G. But the reality is that it really depends on what's available as a spectrum, but also what are the stage, what are the kind of adoption of 4G nowadays, and what are the kind of clearance that is needed. So again, it's a kind of a market by market, and that needs to be assessed correctly. And finally, the availability of the spectrum. The main spectrum that we are looking at as a kind of a mainstream for 5G right now is the mid spectrum, which is around the 3.5 gigahertz, the C band, but also the 700 megahertz. There are other bands available for 5G, and in fact, every single band that you use today for 2G, 3G, 4G will be available in 5G and shortly. But the issue is like which band are the most efficient and cost efficient to use nowadays. And we think that between 3.5 and 700 megahertz, those are the two key bands to be used. And of course, all the issues around the spectrum awards and the spectrum management is not the key focus of this report, but it's really important. And I think we raise that as a kind of to open the door to the discussion with a regulator to say, okay, if you do want to have a proper 5G and to have a fast deployment in your country, when you make the spectrum available, you need to consider the pricing, you need to consider the award approach, and many other things, probably, the kind of a coverage obligation, any other kind of license duration. All those things will impact the ability of our mobile operator members to deploy 5G. So that's, again, it's kind of an open door for this kind of discussion. Next slide, please. So just one thing I want to flag, and I think Tim mentioned that early on the presentation already, is the contiguous bandwidth that is necessary for 5G. I think from our perspective, but also, it's defined as a part of the ITU as well. It's like to have a proper 5G in the mid-band, we believe, at least 80 to 100 megahertz per operator is necessary to have a efficient 5G rollout. That's for the C-band and for any kind of mid-band, but also when we consider millimeter wave bands in the future, then we think around 800 to 1 gigahertz of contiguous spectrum is necessary in the 26 gigahertz or any other millimeter wave. Why is that? We have some studies that we reference in the study in the report. That if you decrease, for example, the number in the middle, if you decrease by 40% the amount of spectrum, you have to increase the number of cell sites by 64% to match the same kind of capacity and coverage. So again, it's all about kind of investment, and if a regulator wants to have efficient 5G rollout, they need to make as much spectrum as possible for the operators. And we know that in MENA countries, some countries are considering only 200 megahertz in a market where they have 3 or 4 operators, and that's why we need to push them to think about releasing more spectrum, 300 to 400 megahertz in the C-band. One go. Next slide, please. So with that, just come back to say what we want to do with this report now. So obviously we shared that report with you today. We shared that with our policy group members a couple of months ago as well for approval. The next step to take it public is, as Mohammed mentioned, we are going to use the platform of Aragnet. Apparently, they have a virtual event in September, which we intend to present this report to them. And in September, that will be the same time we'll try to make this report public, and we will spread it in the social media as well. And we hope for your help as well to propagate and spread these reports. And with that, then we are able to engage with the specific countries. And as I said early on, it is something that each regulator, need to take as a step, is to customize a roadmap for their own market, to look in details of what needs to be done to have a 5G. One of the key messages we push to Aragnet is that such kind of a 5G roadmap is there to provide long-term certainty to the mobile operators, so that each of you can build your 5G business plan around it, and it's really necessary for each country. So we also use the kind of Aragnet as a platform to speak to their ego, to speak to their kind of national 5G kind of ambitions, but also as a kind of a sheer pressure between them to say, who will be able to create the most conducive regulatory environment for the mobile operator to enable 5G. Last slide, please. So with this, I just want to share the last slide. I think outside of this report, we also have a number of other resources available on our website, talking about 5G and 5G spectrum specifically. Those are the few that you can have a look, talk about the mid-band, but also millimeter wave bands. But there are other issues like TDD synchronization, how regulator needs to consider the fact that to assign those spectrum in the C-band, how to enable the kind of synchronization between the different operators. But there are many other things. It's also some around vertical. We're also working on different various positions around public position of the 5G, etc. So with this, I conclude my presentation and pass it back to Mohammed. Mohammed?
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, team and Peng. Let's hear from the audience. Let's take a few questions. So please, if anyone wants to raise a question or comment something, we will give you the opportunity. Rola, please unmute the mic if someone wants to intervene. Otherwise, I have a couple of questions I can ask to our experts.
You might also want to mention, Mohammed, there is a chat, a text chat that people can answer.
Yes,
and ask
of course.
questions.
There is a text chat. You can write down your question or comments also by writing if you don't want to intervene lively. So I see a question from Mubashir Rafiq saying, what is the future of 2.3 gigahertz band for 5G as mainstream band? And Ahmed Harzallah asking, what about 800 and 600 bands also for 5G?
But I'm not, because I'm probably not best placed to answer this. I think Val is on the line and she may have a better think about this. But 2.3 has been awarded in a lot of places as a supplementary band for 4G. And I know that it has been awarded in Saudi Arabia and a few other places as a band to be used for 5G. But it's certainly not universal in the same way that the C-band is. And Peng, I don't know if you have any thoughts about it as well, but I think that there's certainly a lower ecosystem available for that.
Yeah, so on the 2.3, when we look at the system, in fact, for LTE, it has fairly wide availability. In fact, if you look at the GSA website, 2.3 is probably one of the most adopted in the devices. But as Tim mentioned, there's not many countries who have licensed that yet. We see quite a few in APAC, but in Europe, as you know, it is a NATO band, so the release of that band has been quite slow. To adopt it for 5G, I think there's very few countries have done that. So Saudi obviously has done that, but mainly because of the availability, it's only 100 megahertz of spectrum in there. So whether to split into 2 or 3, then you don't have enough bandwidth per operator for proper 5G. It's only possible for 5G, as we said, if you have 80 to 100 megahertz. So it is something that you should consider as a kind of a substitute. If really on the 3.5 is not possible to release more than 200 megahertz, then do something like Saudi did, like to use some of the other mid-band as a substitute. But the 5G ecosystem is not there yet on 3.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, Saudi, of course, released the 2.3 and 2.6, and then the C-band in like quick succession. The other question is about 800 and 600, and again, they can be used for 5G. And actually, in the US and in Canada, 600 is going to be a key 5G band because they've been using 700 for other purposes already. But again, the question comes down to the ecosystem and how many handsets are going to be supporting it. I know that there are going to be more that support 600. There will be some that support 800. But as long as there are enough countries that award this for 5G use, then or rather operators start using it for 5G, because obviously we want it to be technology neutral. As long as there are enough operators that are releasing 5G on that band, then there should be an ecosystem around it. There's a question I noticed from Sahar. The font on my laptop is awful. Sahar Hassan, I think, about choosing 5G use cases before choosing the spectrum. That is a very, very good point. And one of the things that we've been looking at in a lot of detail over the last couple of years, actually, is how 5G is going to be used. Because obviously, if you talk to the vendors, the equipment manufacturers, they talk about different ways that 5G can be used, between enhanced mobile broadband, ultra low latency, or massive machine communications. And the spectrum that you need for each of those is different as well. Generally, the lower two parts of that, the low latency and the massive machine communications, the IoT stuff, although it was seen as kind of one of the big drivers of 5G, it's not where people have been investing their money. They've been investing in enhanced mobile broadband. And that's why when I started talking about what spectrum is needed for 5G, the first things that we are thinking about are how do we replicate what we had for 4G and for 3G in terms of having a sub 1 gig and a sub 6 gig band being used. The C band, it is sort of the main band, in the same way as 1800 was being used for 4G. It's kind of a key band that can be used coverage in some ways, but mainly for capacity in the urban areas. And so, yes, operators need to think about how are they going to roll out 5G to know what spectrum they want. If they are only ever going to roll out 5G for the first 10 years in urban areas, then actually the 700 band isn't that useful to you. It's the C band that you really need.
I just want to make points on 600 megas, so and the 800 megas. So obviously 800 megas today is being used for LTE in a lot of places. I mean, local places, in fact, for at least in region 1, Europe and Africa and MENA. But it is something that for one thing that you need your regulator to do in preparation for migration to 5G is that to request them to have a single license to be technology neutral, so that once the ecosystem is ready for 800, then you can use it for direct 5G. In terms of 600 is a slightly different question. Right? 600 is not yet IMT band for the region in question, in region 1 at least. So it is part of the WRC process that they need to identify band for IMT in the upcoming WRC 23. Also, we know that the ecosystem is already existing in 600. Early on, is earlier than 800 because US has already licensed that band for mobile operators for their 5G use. And we know that some countries in APAC who have mobile allocation, they can use that for mobile as well in the coming years. One of the most interesting ones is India. They're really keen to use that band. So one thing is really when you have that dialogue with your regulator is really to push for that, for them to work on the WRC process as well. make it available in for WRC23, because without that, it's difficult for you to use these bands in the region. So that's my comment on the 600 megahertz.
Peng, we have a question maybe for you from Fouad Ben Khalef about fixed wireless access. So he's saying, what would be a GSMA recommendation to manage existing FWA licenses in C-band?
Okay, so I mean, it really depends on kind of who are holding those bands right now. I mean, the general approach is that fixed wireless license should be converted into mobile license. And regulator, it depends on the regulator. I mean, if the regulator, in order to do that, purely take an administrative fee, that's fine. But a lot of regulator is using that as a kind of opportunity to extract more money. But also in the other, in the other kind of alternative scenario, they regular just want to take it back and re-auction it. That can be that can become even more expensive for mobile operators. So it really depends who are holding. If yourself as a mobile operator are holding those licenses, maybe you want to have as you said, technology neutrality apply to that, and then use it directly for access. But that's really, I think, is something that we can take offline and understand which market you're asking for this question, and we can. But I'm not sure whether, Tim, you have any further kind of recommendation or general practice.
Perhaps I can add something here, Peng. Yeah, if that's okay. Yeah, there are a number of examples already where we have seen that the spectrum that has been awarded has previously been used for broadband wireless access, and actually has continued to be used for broadband wireless access by the winning bidders for the spectrum. A good example is Ireland, where in fact they awarded the C-band spectrum, and the winning bidders, 3 of them were in fact the existing MNOs, but one was already an existing broadband wireless access provider who won spectrum as well. And we're seeing a mix of LTE, BWA and 5G coming along because the licenses are technology neutral. So there is a place for the BWA to continue in the market, even with the re-award of the spectrum. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Val. I was going to say the same for the UK market. When we had a FWA UK broadband, who's been bought up by one of our member operators, and who's been using that band since. But that has been, and in fact, that operator was able to acquire a bit more spectrum in the C-band and use it the quickest way for their 5G.
Yeah, that's correct. And going back to the question about the 2.3 gigahertz band, in some cases, all of the 2.3 gigahertz band has been awarded to a single operator, because really and truly, apart from the ecosystem, there is very little difference between, say, the 2.3 gigahertz and the 2.6 gigahertz bands. And over time, I'm sure the difference will sort of close between the two in terms of cost of equipment and things like that currently differentiate the two bands.
I think it's an interesting point around FWA, and actually this is related to 2300 as well, is that where you have an existing use for fixed wireless access, if you do effectively make it technology neutral and allow people to use that spectrum as they want, then what you will generally tend to find is that they will move to a sort of a coexistence by themselves. They will move to a point where you have FWA, possibly even using 5G technologies, running in coexistence with a 5G network, a 5G mobile network. And the last thing a regulator should be doing is interfering in that process. They should be basically encouraging operators to work it out themselves. Mohammed, I don't know if there are any other questions that you've picked up.
Let me see. Otherwise, I have one question. We have another question from Ahmed Harzallah saying, is there operators that will have spectrum in C-band plus spectrum in 600 band together? This is important to estimate the ecosystem readiness.
Certainly in America there will be some, and I'm doing some work actually at the moment in Peru, looking at some of the ecosystem there. I'm just trying to remember what it is that they are planning, but I seem to remember there's a 600 consideration there as well. So yes, there will be operators around the world, and there'll be some significantly large ones that use C-band and 600 together. I'm not sure about in the Middle East, but certainly around the world.
Okay, thank you. I will finish with one question from my side. Tim, you said that 5G will come as an increment on top of LTE, and Peng, you said that timing for 5G will depend on 4G developments. If I remind one of my first slides that 4G penetration in MENA region is less than a third of the connection are on 4G. 2/3 of our connection are still on legacy networks, 2G and 3G. So if we are to go and to give some recommendation to TRAs in our region that are planning for a 5G move, and where 4G penetration is between, I don't know, 5 to 12 or 13% only, what would be our recommendation to those TRAs?
I think that the main thing that you've got to remember is that when you look at 4G penetration, you're looking at it on a nationwide basis.
Yes.
But that is not how that's not how the population is spread. And that is not how 4G usage spreads. 4G usage is going to be mainly in cities, in urban areas, and in kind of the richer parts of countries. So although you may say that actually over the entire population, 33% has an LTE connection, then it could well be 100% in the capital city.
Exactly.
And that 100% of the capital city is likely to be the people who use it the most, the people who are going to have the highest capacity demands. Which means that actually there is going to be a need for 5G way before you get to 100% rollout of LTE. There will probably be a capacity crunch on LTE in certain areas of the country well before then. So the important thing to point out to a regulator is that you shouldn't be waiting until the whole country is ready for 5G. You need to make sure that 5G spectrum and 5G networks are ready to deploy as soon as they are needed somewhere. And that somewhere may be in the central business district and nowhere else in the country. But you need to make sure that you have the capability there at that point.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
One other aspect is that, if you say 2/3 of the people are only on 2G and 3G today, I think that there's also, something around affordability issue.
Exactly.
And if a regulator or a country want to push to improve the connectivity and especially to improve the digitalization today, I think affordability need to be looked at
Exactly.
in the back.
They need to understand why people are not using 4G services, of course. They are not ready.
But at
It's
least
a problem of taxation, of
device,
smartphone adoption. Yeah.
Yeah, at least in the short term, on the device side, I still see 4G devices to be much cheaper than 5G devices over the next 2-3 years at least. You can have a really cheap 4G smartphone, in the $50 range, whereas 5G has come down a lot already, but it's still probably around $200-300 range. So if you want to have people move into adopt the mobile broadband and use that for the digitalization, I think 4G is still a lot to offer. Has still a lot to offer.
Exactly.
Let's not forget, our member operators have only started deploying that, 4, 5, 7 years ago, depending on the market.
Yeah.
And return on investment is not there yet. So having more spectrum, adding that into the kind of the existing cell sites is a kind of a cheaper way to deploy additional capacity as well. So if they have spectrum that haven't made available, especially in the key 4G band today, like 800, 1800, 2.6, etc. If they haven't made that available, that's the first step they need to make. And as indicated in the report, there are a lot of countries who need to still think about the 4G deployment first or 5G.
Thank you. Shall I finish with, let me see, we have something written. Thank you. Okay, this is, thank you. Question to Plum, maybe last one. In MENA, we have some governments or defense users who are occupying some of the core mobile bands. It is sometimes, if not to say always, tricky to vacate the band. So what would be our recommendation here? Should we argue for them to vacate or maybe look for other alternatives?
Would you like to pick one up, Tim?
Yes, you can. I was going to say it depends, but go ahead, Val.
Okay. Yes, it is not unusual, and those are issues other countries face as well, not just in the MENA region.
Yeah.
Ideally, we would ask the regulator to discuss with these current governmental users whether or not there is a potential for them to be moved just in part of the band and therefore release another part of the band. And that has happened across Europe, whereby the governmental use has been just squeezed up into a corner of the band. The other possibility is whether or not they could be migrated to other frequency bands, or even if their use is such that it is only in a limited geographic area, perhaps around embassies, things like that, and therefore it's possible to use the spectrum elsewhere, but not in those specific geographic locations. But it is a problem, and there's got to be a willingness for the governmental people and the regulators to work together to come to a solution.
Yeah, and I think there's also worthwhile thinking about the fact that the international cooperation is a key thing here. Because if you have a situation where you have a military use of a certain band, but everywhere else in the world that band is now being used to run 5G services, then you're going to come across interference issues. So actually, trying to move away from that band and or kind of reducing the use of that band is going to be helpful to the government anyway.
Thank you.
So I think the answer to your question is yes, they should be encouraged to release as much of it as possible, and preferably try and use something else.
I think we arrived to the end of the session. If you don't have anything else to add it from Plum or Peng, I will thank you, our audience, and thank you, Val, Tim, and Peng. Anything to add it from your side? Any final point? No? Okay. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the participants. And as I said, we will be sharing later, Rola, my colleague, will be sharing later a link to download the slide deck and the record of the session. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Bye.